The tray slipped from Elena Whitmore's hands the moment the tall doors swung open without warning, and 3 porcelain cups shattered against the marble floor before she even saw who had walked in. She dropped to her knees at once, gathering the broken pieces with fingers that would not stop trembling, because a housekeeper's daughter who broke the good china did not get a second chance to explain herself. She had heard the stories. A girl named Grace had been sent away for less, 2 winters ago, with no reference and no wages owed to her. "Leave it," a man's voice said above her. She did not leave it. She kept gathering the shards faster now, because stopping felt more dangerous than bleeding, and one sharp edge caught the side of her thumb before she could pull her hand back. A bead of blood welled up and dropped onto the white marble, small and bright and impossible to hide. A hand came down beside hers, closing gently around her wrist. She looked up and understood in the space of one breath that the man kneeling across from her was not a footman or a guest. He wore travel clothes dusted with 3 weeks of road, and his face had the kind of stillness that belonged to someone used to being obeyed without asking twice. Nobody in Ashworth Manor knelt on the floor for anyone, except, apparently, him. "You're bleeding," he said, as if this were the only fact in the room that mattered. "It's nothing, my lord." She did not know yet that he was not simply a lord. She only knew that his eyes were the color of storm water and that he had not let go of her wrist. "It's something," he said, and wrapped his own handkerchief around her thumb before she could protest, tying it with the quick, practical motion of a man who had bandaged worse things in worse places. "What is your name?" "Elena, my lord, Elena Whitmore." "Whitmore?" He repeated it slowly, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth. "Any relation to Mrs. Pretty, who runs this house like a ship in a storm?" "Her daughter, my lord." Something shifted behind his eyes, some small recalculation she could not read. He rose to his feet and offered her his hand, and she stared at it for a full second before she understood he actually meant to help her up. A housekeeper's daughter, in front of 2 footmen who had frozen in the doorway like men, watching something they were not sure they were allowed to see. She took his hand because refusing would have drawn more attention than accepting. "Nathaniel Ashworth," he said. "I own this ship, apparently, as of 3 days ago, though nobody has told the staff yet that I've returned early." The Duke. She had heard he was coming home from the continent, eventually, in the vague way one hears about weather 3 counties over. Nobody had said eventually meant today, meant now, meant that she would be standing in front of him with his handkerchief wrapped around her bleeding thumb and broken china scattered at their feet like an omen nobody wanted to read. "I'll fetch a broom, my lord," she said, and fled before he could answer. Her mother found her 20 minutes later in the linen room, pressing a cold cloth to her thumb, and did not ask what had happened. Mrs. Pretty had run this house for 18 years and had learned to read her daughter's silences the way other women read letters. "You broke something." "I dropped a tray, he caught me at it." Her mother's hands went still over the folded sheets. "The Duke." "He bandaged my hand himself, Mama, in front of Peter and the other one, the new footman. He wouldn't let go until I let him." Mrs. Pretty sat down slowly on the low bench by the window, and for a moment she looked older than Elena had ever seen her look, older than the gray in her hair or the lines at her mouth had ever suggested. "Listen to me," she said. "A duke who is kind to a servant girl for one afternoon is not remarkable. A duke who remembers her name a week later is a different animal entirely, and you are not equipped to hunt that animal, Elena. You will get hurt, and I do not mean your thumb." Elena said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say, and because some small reckless part of her had already decided her mother was going to be proven wrong. She was not wrong about the remembering. 3 days later, Elena was sent to deliver the household ledgers to the library, a task normally reserved for Edmund, the steward, who had taken ill with a fever that kept him in bed with a compress on his forehead, and strict instructions from the doctor to move as little as possible. She carried the heavy books down the long gallery with her arms aching and her mind occupied entirely with not dropping anything else in this house. And so she did not notice the rain until she was already outside, crossing the open stretch of gravel between the kitchen wing and the main house, and the sky simply opened above her without any warning at all. She ran the last 20 feet and arrived under the portico soaked through, clutching 3 ledgers to her chest like they were the only dry thing left in the world, and found the Duke already standing there, sheltering from the same sudden storm, an open umbrella held loosely in one hand as though he had forgotten he was holding it. "You again," he said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice, which confused her more than anything else that had happened so far. "The rain again, my lord," she answered before she could stop herself, and then felt her stomach drop at her own boldness. Servants did not make wry comments to dukes. Servants said yes, my lord, and no, my lord, and kept their opinions folded up small where nobody could see them. But he laughed, a short surprised sound, and stepped closer, tilting the umbrella so it covered them both even though the portico roof already kept them dry, as if he simply wanted the excuse to stand nearer. "Edmund is ill," he said. "You've been managing his work." "Only the carrying, my lord, not the arithmetic. I'm not clever enough for the arithmetic." "I doubt that very much." He looked at her the way he had looked at her wrist that first day, that careful recalculating look, and then he reached out and took 2 of the 3 ledgers from her arms without asking, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for a duke to carry his own household books through the rain. "Come, before you drown under the weight of these, and I have to explain to your mother why I let it happen." They walked together to the library, and he did not hand the books to a footman to carry the last stretch, and he did not let go of the conversation either, asking her small, ordinary questions: how long her family had served the house, whether she had ever left the county, what she read when she had an hour to herself, and she found herself answering honestly because lying to him felt somehow impossible, like trying to lie to weather. In the library, while she set the ledgers on the great desk, her eyes caught on a line of poetry printed on a loose page left open on a side table, and without thinking she murmured the next line under her breath, the way she always did when she found a poem she loved halfway finished. "You know Fitzgerald's translation," Nathaniel said, and she startled, having forgotten entirely that she was not alone. "My father taught me to read from a book of poems, my lord. He couldn't afford much else to teach me from." "He taught you well." He picked up the page and read the next line aloud himself, matching the one she had spoken, and for a moment they stood on either side of the desk finishing a stranger's poem together, and something passed between them that neither one of them named, because nomming it would have made it real, and real things had consequences that a duke and a housekeeper's daughter could not afford. After that afternoon, small things began to happen, quietly, the way frost creeps across a window overnight so that nobody sees the moment it starts, only the moment it is already everywhere. A book appeared on the bench outside the kitchen garden where Alina took her half-hour of rest each afternoon, a worn copy of poems she had once mentioned wanting to read again, with no note attached and no explanation offered. She knew who had left it. There was only one person in the house who would have known which poems, and known enough not to sign his name to the gift. A week later, on her half-day, she found the gray mare saddled and waiting at the stable when she had only ever been permitted to walk the grounds before, and the stable boy told her, looking faintly bewildered by his own instructions, that his grace had asked for the horse to be readied for Miss Whitmore's use whenever she wished it. She rode along the eastern fields that afternoon with the wind pulling loose strands of hair free from her cap, and she did not see him anywhere, and yet she felt, the entire time, as though the whole ride had been arranged for her like a gift wrapped in the shape of ordinary permission. Then came the evening in the rain again, weeks later, when she was walking back from the village with a basket of thread for her mother, and the sky broke open exactly as it had that first time, as though the weather itself had developed a habit of throwing them together. This time there was no portico to shelter under, only open road, and she was soaked through within a minute, laughing despite herself at the absurdity of being caught twice by the same trick, when a carriage slowed beside her, and the door opened before the wheels had fully stopped. "Get in," Nathaniel said, "before your mother blames me for a chill as well as everything else she already blames me for." "She doesn't blame you for anything, my lord. She blames me for existing near you. I've seen the look. I understand it perfectly." He shrugged out of his own coat and settled it over her shoulders the moment she climbed in beside him, without asking, without making it into anything larger than practical kindness, though both of them understood it was not only that. They rode in silence for a while, rain drumming steady against the carriage roof, and Alina watched him from the corner of her eye, this man who owned the ground beneath the wheels and the house at the end of the road, and technically, the very coat now warming her shoulders, and she thought about her mother's warning, the animal too dangerous for her to hunt, and she thought that perhaps her mother had gotten the shape of the danger wrong. It was not that Alina might be hurt chasing him. It was that she had already stopped being able to imagine a version of her life that did not include him in it, and that kind of wanting did not need to be hunted. It had already found her and moved in. He walked her to the servants' entrance himself that evening, coat and all, ignoring the startled faces of two maids who happened to be crossing the yard at exactly the wrong moment. And at the door he paused, and for one long second she thought he might close the distance between them entirely, might do the thing that could not be undone once it was done. He didn't. "Good night, Alina," he said instead, using her name without the title for the first time, and stepped back into the rain alone. That same night in his study, Nathaniel sat across from Edmund, recovered enough from his fever to sit upright and hold a pen, and dictated a short, quiet instruction that the steward wrote down without comment, though his eyebrows rose slightly as he wrote it. No contracts were to be drawn with the Farringdon family, nor the Hollies family, nor Lord Wexley's daughter, despite the 3 separate letters of interest currently sitting unanswered in the correspondence drawer. Nathaniel had already decided, in some quiet, unshakable part of himself, exactly who he intended to marry, and it was none of the names written so carefully on any of those letters. He had not told Alina. He had not told his mother, the Dowager Duchess, who was still traveling and would not return to Ashworth for another fortnight. He had told no one but Edmund, and only because a signature on a legal document required a witness. But the decision sat inside him now, settled and certain, the way a stone settles at the bottom of still water, and nothing that happened afterward, not his mother's fury nor the county's disbelief, nor the long cold months still waiting ahead of both of them, would move it from where it had come to rest. The Dowager Duchess Margaret returned to Ashworth on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning she had already summoned Alina to the linen room, a place chosen, Alina understood immediately, precisely because it held no chairs, no comfort, and no witnesses. "You are the housekeeper's daughter," the Duchess said, not as a question. She was a tall woman with silver hair pinned so tightly it looked painful, and eyes that measured everything they touched, including, now, Alina's worn dress and reddened hands. "Alina, is it?" "Yes, my lady. My son has been unusually attentive to household matters since his return. Ledgers, correspondence, the condition of the Eastern stable, small things, you understand, that a duke ought never to concern himself with personally, and yet he has developed a sudden passion for overseeing them himself." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it grew uncomfortable. "I am told these small matters frequently require his presence wherever you happen to be standing." Alina said nothing, because there was no safe answer, and silence, at least, could not be quoted back to her later. "He is not yours to keep," the Duchess said finally, quietly, without any cruelty in her voice at all, which somehow made it worse than cruelty would have been. "And you are not his to ruin. Do you understand me, girl? I do not say this to wound you. I say it because you are young enough to still believe kindness from a powerful man means something more than what it is. What is it, my lady, if not kindness? The Duchess studied her for a long moment, something almost like respect flickering behind the measuring look. It is the beginning of a story that ends badly for exactly one of the two people in it, and it is never the Duke. She left without waiting for a response, her skirts sweeping the corridor floor, and Alina stood alone among the folded sheets for a long time afterward, turning the warning over and over, trying to find the place where it did not apply to her, and failing to find it, and deciding to want him anyway. That was the danger her mother had spoken of, she realized. Not that she might get hurt reaching for something too high. It was that she had already stopped caring whether reaching was wise. She did not tell Nathaniel about the conversation. She did not need to. He seemed to know regardless, the way he seemed to know most things that happened under his own roof, and the following evening he found her in the kitchen garden at dusk, sitting on the same bench where the book of poems had once appeared without explanation. "My mother spoke to you," he said, sitting beside her without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "She was not unkind, my lord. She rarely is. She is simply thorough." He picked a small white flower from the bush beside the bench and turned it between his fingers instead of looking at her, which she had come to understand meant he was choosing his words with unusual care. "She is not wrong to be concerned. The world we live in has very particular ideas about who a duke is permitted to want, and none of those ideas include a housekeeper's daughter who reads poetry to herself in empty libraries." "Then perhaps you should stop finding reasons to stand near me, my lord. It would save us both considerable trouble." "I've considered that." He finally looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression that she had not seen there before, something that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I find I am remarkably bad at taking my own good advice." "That sounds like a flaw in a man who owns half the county." "It is the only flaw I have that I refuse to correct." He set the flower down on the bench between them, a small deliberate offering, and rose to his feet before either of them could do something neither of them was ready for yet. "Good night, Alina." She watched him walk back toward the house, tall and unhurried, and she picked up the flower and pressed it between the pages of her book of poems that night, where it stayed, flattening slowly. A small pale ghost of that evening kept safe between two pages nobody else would ever think to open. The following weeks passed in a rhythm that Alina would later remember as the happiest of her entire life, though at the time it felt too ordinary to name as happiness. The way a person standing in warm sunlight rarely stops to marvel at the warmth until winter arrives and takes it away. Nathaniel found reasons, always small, always plausible, always deniable to anyone who might ask. He required her assistance cataloging the library's older volumes, a task that took considerably longer than it should have, because they kept stopping to read passages aloud to each other, arguing gently about which translations were superior, laughing at footnotes written by scholars who had clearly never left their own studies. He asked after her mother's health with a genuine attentiveness that made Mrs. Pretty's suspicions soften, slowly, against her own better judgment, into something closer to cautious hope. He rode with her along the eastern fields on Sunday afternoons, always with a groom trailing at a respectful distance, always within the strict boundaries of propriety. And yet every ride left Alina feeling as though something essential between them had shifted a little further from where it had started. There was an afternoon in late autumn when a sudden wind knocked a heavy branch loose from an old oak near the stable, and it fell directly across the path, just as Alina's mare shied sideways in fright. She was thrown, hard, landing on her shoulder in the wet grass, and before she had even finished processing the fall, Nathaniel was off his own horse and kneeling over her, his hands moving across her arms and shoulders with a doctor's careful precision, checking for breaks, his voice low and steady even though his face had gone pale as chalk. Alina, look at me. Can you move your fingers?" She moved them, more startled by the fear in his voice than by the fall itself. "I'm well, my lord, truly. It was only a fright." "You frightened me considerably more than it frightened you," he said, and then, as though the words had escaped before he could stop them, "I don't think I could bear it if something happened to you." The sentence hung between them in the cold autumn air, too large and too honest to take back, and for a moment neither of them moved, kneeling together in the wet grass with the fallen branch beside them and the horses shifting nervously a few feet away. "My lord," she said softly, "you shouldn't say things like that to me." "I know." He helped her to her feet slowly, keeping one hand at her waist longer than balance required. "I'm going to keep saying them regardless. I've apparently decided that being sensible is a habit I no longer have any interest in maintaining." She should have stepped away from him then. She understood with perfect clarity exactly what the Duchess's warning had meant, exactly what kind of ending waited at the bottom of this particular staircase if she kept climbing it. But his hand was warm at her waist, and his eyes held nothing but honest fear for her safety, and some quiet, reckless part of her decided, in that cold field with a broken branch between them, that she would rather have this and lose it than never have had it at all. It was 3 weeks later, on a night heavy with frost, that they nearly crossed the line neither of them had spoken of directly. Alina had been sent to close the garden gate after a late delivery, and Nathaniel had found her there under the old stone archway, moonlight silvering the frost on the ivy above them, and something in the stillness of the night had made all the careful distance between them feel suddenly unnecessary. He stepped closer than he ever had before, close enough that she could see the uneven rhythm of his breath in the cold air, close enough that her own breath caught and held. "Alina," he said, and his voice had dropped to something low and unguarded, "I have spent 3 months telling myself that wanting you is a temporary weakness. I no longer believe that. I don't think it was ever temporary at all." His hand rose to touch her jaw, gentle, questioning, and she felt herself leaning into it before she had consciously decided to, felt the entire careful architecture of caution she had built around herself, these past weeks begin to crumble at the first real touch of his fingers against her skin. He did not close the distance further. At the very last moment, with barely a breath of space left between them, he stopped, his forehead nearly resting against hers, his hand still cradling her jaw as though he could not quite bring himself to let go even while refusing to finish what he had started. "Not like this," he whispered. "Not stolen in a garden at midnight like something I'm ashamed of. You deserve better than a secret, Alina. I want to do this properly, in front of everyone who will ever have an opinion about it, so that no one can ever say afterward that I was uncertain." He stepped back, and the cold air rushed into the space where his warmth had been, and Alina stood alone under the frosted archway with her heart pounding and her jaw still tingling faintly where his fingers had rested, understanding that something had just been decided between them even though nothing had technically happened at all. 2 days later, invitations began arriving at every great house in the county, gold-edged and formally worded, announcing His Grace the Duke of Ashworth's birthday ball, to be held in 3 weeks' time, with an unusual line at the bottom that several recipients would later admit had caused considerable speculation over their breakfast tables, an announcement of particular significance to be made that evening. Nathaniel found Edmund in the study that same afternoon and gave him a second quiet instruction, one that made the steward set down his pen entirely and stare at his employer for a long moment before finally nodding and picking the pen back up. He intended to announce his engagement at his own ball, in front of the whole county, in front of every family who had ever assumed their daughter might be the one chosen, in front of his own mother, who would have no room left to maneuver him quietly out of a decision he had made in full public view. There would be no private conversations afterward, where reasonable people convinced him to reconsider. There would be no space for the Duchess to produce some more suitable alternative and present it as inevitable. He would say it once, loudly, irreversibly, and the entire county would simply have to arrange itself around the truth once it was spoken. He did not tell Alina the specifics. He told her only, in the library one evening while helping her return a stack of returned volumes to their shelves, that she should attend the ball, and that a gown would be sent to her, and that she should trust him, whatever else happened that night, however strange or sudden it might seem. "My lord," she said carefully, "servants do not attend the family's balls. You will attend this one." He took her hand, briefly, publicly reckless in a way he had never allowed himself to be before, right there among the shelves where any passing maid might have seen. "I am asking you to trust me, Alina. Just this once completely, without asking me to explain myself first." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for whatever certainty had settled there, and found it, solid and unshaken, the same quiet certainty she had sensed in him since the very first day he had knelt beside her and wrapped his handkerchief around her bleeding thumb. "I trust you," she said, and meant it entirely, not yet knowing how completely that trust was about to be tested, nor how quickly a single carefully planned evening could be turned, by someone determined enough, into the very thing Nathaniel had built the whole ball to prevent. The gown arrived the morning of the ball, wrapped in plain brown paper with no card attached, delivered by a young footman who would not meet Alina's eyes as he set the box down outside the servants' quarters, and hurried away as though he had been given strict instructions not to linger and answer questions. She untied the string with careful fingers and lifted the paper away to find deep blue silk folded inside, simple in its cut but clearly costly, the kind of fabric she had only ever seen from a distance on the shoulders of women who arrived at Ashworth in carriages rather than on foot. Her mother stood in the doorway watching her lift the dress free, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "He means to do something tonight," Mrs. Pretty said finally, "something he cannot take back afterward." "I think so, Mama." "And you intend to let him?" Alina held the gown against herself and looked at her mother in the small cracked mirror above the washstand, seeing for the first time how the deep blue changed the color of her own eyes, how the woman looking back at her seemed, for one strange suspended moment, like someone entirely different from the girl who scrubbed hearths and carried ledgers through the rain. "I love him, Mama. I have tried very hard these past months not to, and I have failed completely, and I don't think I want to keep trying." Her mother crossed the small room and touched the silk gently, her expression caught somewhere between fear and something that might have been pride. "Then wear it well tonight, my girl. Whatever happens, wear it like you were born to it, because from where I'm standing, watching what that boy has done to keep from marrying any of those cold society daughters, I think perhaps you were." The ballroom that evening blazed with candlelight. Hundreds of small flames reflected endlessly in tall gilt mirrors along every wall, and the county's finest families arrived in a steady procession of carriages, silk gowns rustling against polished floors, jewelry catching the light in sharp cold flashes, as their owners moved through rooms designed specifically to be looked at while looking at everyone else in return. Alina came down the main staircase at the hour Nathaniel had quietly told her, not through the servants' passage she had used every day of her life in this house, but down the wide front stairs meant for guests, her hand resting lightly on the polished banister, her heart beating so hard she was certain the nearest violin could have matched its rhythm without missing a note. Conversation did not stop entirely when she reached the bottom, but it thinned, noticeably, in a widening circle around her, heads turning, voices dropping to the particular hushed register people used when they wanted to gossip without appearing to gossip at all. She recognized faces from the village, from church on Sundays, women who had nodded to her politely in the market, and men who had tipped their hats without ever truly seeing her. And now every one of those faces wore the same expression, a mixture of confusion and calculation, trying to place her, trying to understand why the housekeeper's daughter stood among them in silk the color of a summer evening sky. Nathaniel found her within moments, cutting cleanly through the gathering crowd as though the entire room had simply arranged itself to let him pass. And when he reached her, he did not hesitate, did not lower his voice, did not treat the moment as anything requiring apology or explanation. "You look extraordinary," he said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear clearly, and offered her his arm in front of everyone. She took it. The room noticed. Whispers rippled outward from that single small gesture like water disturbed by a dropped stone, and Alina felt herself being pulled, gently and irreversibly, into the center of something she could no longer step back out of even if she wanted to. They danced twice, which was itself a scandal, and between dances he kept her close beside him, introducing her to acquaintances with a simple, unadorned honesty that offered no apology for her presence. Only her name, spoken clearly, as though it were a fact requiring no further comment. Lord Bertram Hale, a florid, self-satisfied man who had spent the better part of 2 months courting one of the Duchess's preferred candidates for Nathaniel's hand, watched the entire display with narrowing eyes from across the room, his jaw tight, his gaze following Alina with an interest that had nothing kind in it at all. At the appointed hour, as the orchestra paused between sets and servants moved discreetly through the crowd refilling glasses of champagne, Nathaniel climbed the 3 shallow steps to the small raised platform where the musicians usually sat, and raised his own glass, and the room, sensing the moment it had gathered to witness, fell into an expectant hush. "Thank you all for joining me tonight," he began, his voice carrying easily across the vast room without any need to shout. "I have spent the better part of this evening watching many of you try, with admirable subtlety, to guess at the announcement promised on your invitations. I won't keep you guessing any longer." He looked directly at Alina as he said it, and every head in the room turned to follow his gaze, and Alina felt the full weight of several hundred eyes settle on her at once, heavy and bright and inescapable. "I intend to marry Alina Witt." He did not finish the name. The Dowager Duchess Margaret stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, a folded letter held aloft in one gloved hand, her voice cutting through the room with the practiced precision of a woman who had spent decades commanding attention in exactly this kind of setting. "Before you say another word, Nathaniel, I think this county deserves to know the truth about the young woman you are proposing to elevate above every family gathered in this room tonight." The room, already hushed, went utterly silent. "I have here a letter," the Duchess continued, unfolding it with deliberate slowness, "from a Mrs. Harold Fenwick of Bristol, a widow in whose household this same Alina Whitmore was previously employed as a companion, before her mother secured her the position at Ashworth. Mrs. Fenwick writes that she dismissed the girl without reference after discovering a considerable sum of money missing from her writing desk, money the girl claimed had been given to her as a gift, though no witness could ever confirm such a gift was ever made." A murmur swept through the crowd like wind through dry grass, rising and swelling, dozens of low, urgent conversations breaking out at once, and Alina felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet, felt Nathaniel's arm tense where her hand still rested against it. "That is not true," Alina said, and her voice, though steady, seemed impossibly small against the growing noise of the room. "I have never in my life worked in Bristol. I have never met a Mrs. Fenwick." "Of course you would say that," the Duchess replied, not unkindly, which somehow made the accusation land harder than cruelty would have. "But I have the letter dated and signed, and I have a witness in this very room who confirms the account." She turned slightly, and a woman Alina had never seen before, elegantly dressed, unfamiliar in every detail, stepped forward from near the refreshment table and inclined her head in solemn confirmation. "That woman is a stranger to me," Alina said, louder now, panic beginning to fray the edges of her composure. "My lord, you know me. You know I have never left this county in my life. I have never." "I know," Nathaniel said, turning to face her fully, taking both her hands in his in front of the entire assembled county, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear it clearly amid the rising noise. "Alina, look at me. I know this is false. I will prove it is false if it takes me a year to do it." But he did not deny it publicly, not immediately. Not in the single crucial second when denial would have mattered most, because in that second his eyes had flicked, involuntarily, toward the sea of watching faces, the assembled weight of every family whose good opinion had shaped his entire life until now, and that flicker, that half-second of hesitation before he turned back to speak in her defense, was the only thing Alina would remember clearly afterward when she tried, later, to understand exactly where the evening had broken. It was not that he doubted her. She understood that even in the moment, even through the roaring panic in her own ears, it was that he was a duke standing in a room full of witnesses who already believed the worst, and hesitation, however brief, however understandable, was its own kind of answer, and the room had already heard it. "This is absurd," Nathaniel said finally, turning back to face the crowd, his voice rising with real anger now. "I will not stand here and allow a forged letter and a paid witness to—" "Paid?" the Duchess interrupted sharp. "You accuse me of purchasing testimony against the very girl you intend to marry. Nathaniel, listen to yourself." The room had fractured entirely by now into competing currents of whispered speculation. Some faces turned toward Alina with open suspicion, others toward the Duke with something closer to pity, as though he had simply been fooled by a clever girl in a borrowed gown. And Alina, standing at the center of all of it with her hands still held in his, felt something inside her go very quiet and very cold. A stillness that had nothing to do with calm, and everything to do with the particular numbness that arrives only after the worst has already happened. "My lord," she said quietly, pulling her hands free of his, "I think I should leave." "Alina, no, stay, let me finish this, let me." "You already finished it," she said, not with anger, though anger would have been easier to bear than the flat, exhausted honesty in her own voice. "You looked at them before you looked at me. I saw it. I understand why. I even understand that you didn't mean to. But I felt it happen, my lord, and I don't think I can stand here and pretend that I didn't." She turned and walked toward the staircase, and this time the crowd parted for her not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to instinct. The way people step back automatically from anything that looks like it might be about to break. Nathaniel called her name once sharply, and took 2 steps after her before his mother's hand closed around his arm, not restraining him exactly, but reminding him, in the particular silent language mothers and sons share, of exactly how many eyes were still watching, and exactly how much worse the evening would become if the Duke of Ashworth chased a servant girl up his own staircase in front of the entire county. He stopped. It was only a second of stopping. It was enough. Alina reached her small room above the kitchens with her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage the buttons at the back of the borrowed gown, and when she finally worked it free, she did not throw it on the floor or tear at it in the fury she might have expected herself to feel. She folded it instead with careful, deliberate movements, smoothing the deep blue silk flat across her narrow bed, because whatever else had happened that night, she would not be accused, on top of everything else, of stealing so much as a single thread of it. She dressed in her own worn gray dress, the one she had arrived at Ashworth in years ago, and packed the few things that belonged entirely to her: a comb, a small tin box of coins saved slowly over months, the book of poems with the flattened white flower still pressed between its pages, and she left the folded silk gown behind on the bed like something returned rather than something abandoned. Her mother met her at the bottom of the back stairs, already awake, already dressed, as though some part of her had known this exact night was coming from the very first afternoon Alina had come home, with a stranger's handkerchief wrapped around her thumb. "You don't have to go tonight," Mrs. Pretty said, though her voice carried no real conviction behind the offer. "I do, Mama. If I stay until morning, he'll find some way to convince me to stay longer than that, and I don't have the strength left tonight to be convinced of anything." Alina pressed her forehead briefly against her mother's shoulder, the closest thing to tears she allowed herself in that doorway. "I'll write when I'm settled somewhere. I promise you that much." She walked the 3 miles to the village crossroads alone, under a sky gone hard and starless, and caught the earliest coach out at dawn with nearly all the coins from her small tin box, buying passage as far from Ashworth as the money would carry her, to a mill town whose name she chose almost at random from a list posted at the coaching inn, simply because it was far enough away that no one there would have ever heard the name Ashworth spoken in connection with her own. Behind her, in a house still littered with the wreckage of a ball that had ended in accusation rather than celebration, Nathaniel Ashworth stood alone in his study long after the last carriage had rolled away down the drive, staring at a letter with a signature he was already beginning, in the cold, clear light of his own fury, to suspect had never belonged to any real widow in Bristol at all. Nathaniel did not sleep that night, nor the night after. He sat in his study surrounded by every ledger, every letter, every scrap of correspondence his household had produced in the past 6 months, searching for the thread that would unravel the lie his mother had thrown across the ballroom floor like a net designed to catch exactly one person. He began with the letter itself. A widow named Mrs. Harold Fenwick of Bristol, the Duchess had claimed, and so he wrote that same night to a solicitor he trusted in Bristol, a man named Peter Ashby who had handled small legal matters for the Ashworth estate for over a decade, asking him to confirm the existence of any household by that name, any record of a companion dismissed under the circumstances described, any trace at all of the story his mother had presented as established fact. The reply came back within the week, and it told him exactly what some quiet, certain part of himself had already known before he ever sent the inquiry. No household under the name Fenwick had employed a companion matching Alina's description in the past 5 years. No widow by that name currently resided at the address given in the letter his mother had waved before the entire county. The address itself, when Peter Ashby sent an associate to investigate in person, turned out to belong to an empty townhouse, shuttered and unoccupied, its previous tenant having moved abroad the prior spring. Armed with this, Nathaniel turned his attention to the mysterious witness, the elegantly dressed stranger who had stepped forward at exactly the right moment to confirm his mother's accusation with a single solemn nod. It took considerably longer to trace her. Nearly 3 weeks of careful, discreet inquiry conducted through Edmund and a hired investigator who specialized in matters requiring both patience and discretion. But eventually, a name emerged. A woman named Cora Blythe, an actress of modest reputation who had, according to 2 separate sources willing to speak in exchange for a small consideration, been paid a substantial sum shortly before the ball to appear at a social event and confirm whatever story she was given, without any need to understand or care whether the story was true. The trail led, inevitably and with a kind of bitter clarity that made Nathaniel's hands shake with fury as he read the final report, directly back to his own mother's household accounts, to a payment recorded under a vague heading that meant nothing to anyone who did not already know precisely what to look for. He confronted her in the same study where he had once quietly instructed Edmund to draw up no contracts with any of the county's eligible daughters. The Dowager Duchess did not deny it, not entirely, not once she understood how thoroughly he had already traced every piece of it back to her own signature. "I did it to protect you," she said, sitting very straight in her chair, her composure unbroken even now, even caught. "You cannot see it yet, Nathaniel, because you are young and in love and certain that love excuses everything. But a duke who marries beneath his station does not simply risk his own comfort. He risks the name, the tenants, every family whose livelihood depends on this estate standing in a world that judges harshly and forgives rarely. I did not lie to hurt her. I lied because I could not think of any other way to stop you from ruining everything my husband and I built." "You did not stop me from marrying her," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet with a coldness his mother had never heard from him before. "You stopped me from marrying her with her dignity intact. You took the one thing I was trying hardest to give her, a public claiming, a room full of witnesses to the truth, and you turned it into the very humiliation I built the whole evening to prevent. I do not know if I can forgive that, Mother. I genuinely do not know." He sent her to the dower house on the far edge of the estate within the month. Not banished exactly, still comfortable, still provided for, but removed entirely from the daily management of Ashworth and from any further influence over decisions that were no longer hers to make. It was the hardest letter he had ever written, harder even than the ones he would soon send searching for Alina, because it meant admitting, formally and permanently, that the woman who had raised him had also been willing to destroy the one thing he wanted most in order to keep him exactly where she believed he belonged. Finding Alina proved harder than clearing her name. She had left no forwarding address, had told no one at Ashworth where she intended to go beyond the vague promise to write once she was settled, and the letter she eventually sent her mother, weeks later, gave no return address at all, only a brief assurance that she was safe, employed, and asked that no one come looking for her. Nathaniel read that letter, borrowed briefly from Mrs. Pretty with her reluctant permission, at least a dozen times, searching each careful sentence for any clue as to where it had been posted, and finally noticed what Alina herself had likely hoped no one would notice. A faint postmark, smudged but not entirely illegible, nomming a mill town 3 counties north, a place called Ellsworth, known mainly for its textile works and the steady stream of workers who arrived there each year seeking wages a failing farm economy could no longer provide. He went himself, not with the carriage that announced his rank to every mile of road it traveled, not with footmen or an entourage that would have made him impossible to miss in a town of modest working families, but alone, on a hired horse, dressed in plain traveling clothes that gave away nothing of who he was to anyone who happened to pass him on the road. It took 4 days of careful, quiet inquiry in Ellsworth, 4 days of showing a description rather than a name to landladies and shopkeepers and mill foremen, before he found the boarding house on the town's eastern edge, where a young woman matching that description had taken a room under the name Alina Hart. He climbed the narrow stairs to her room as evening fell, his heart pounding harder than it ever had facing anything in his life, and knocked, and waited. And when the door finally opened, he found himself looking at a woman he barely recognized in the dim lamplight. Thinner than he remembered, her hands roughened with new calluses from work he could only guess at, her hair pulled back in a severe knot that did nothing to soften the exhaustion visible in her face. "You shouldn't be here," Alina said, and made no move to let him in. "I know. I mean it, my lord. I have a position here, a quiet life. No one asks me questions about dukes or dowagers or forged letters, and I have finally stopped waking up every morning expecting the roof to fall in around me. I don't want that disturbed." "I've cleared your name," he said before she could close the door, the words spilling out faster than he had planned to say them. "The letter was forged. The witness was paid. My mother arranged the entire thing, and I have proof of every piece of it, documented and witnessed, ready to be shown to anyone in the county who ever doubted you for a single moment. I've sent her to the dower house. She no longer manages any part of the estate." Alina's expression did not soften as much as he had hoped it would. If anything, something in it grew wearier, more resigned. "That's very thorough of you, my lord. I'm sure it cost you a great deal to do it." "Alina, I believe you," she said quietly, cutting him off before he could continue. "I never doubted you'd eventually prove it wasn't true. I know you well enough to know you would move mountains before you'd let a lie about me stand unchallenged forever. That was never the part that broke, my lord." "Then tell me what was." She was quiet for a long moment, standing in the narrow doorway with lamplight flickering behind her. And when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the anger he might have expected and braced himself for, only a plain, exhausted honesty that somehow hurt far more than fury would have. "You hesitated," she said. "Just for a second. I know it was only a second. I know you're going to tell me a second means nothing, that a whole roomful of eyes turning on you at once would make anyone's voice catch, even for a moment, even a duke's. But I stood there in that room, wearing a gown you gave me, having trusted you completely for the first time in my entire life, and I watched you look at everyone else in that room before you looked back at me. And some part of me understood in that second exactly how this would go for the rest of our lives together, if we had a life together at all. Every difficult moment, every hard choice, some small part of you would always look toward the room first." "That's not fair," Nathaniel said, though even as he said it he understood with a sinking clarity that fairness had very little to do with what she was describing. "I love you, Alina. I have loved you since the day I knelt beside you on that marble floor, and you refused to let go of a single broken piece of china until your own hand was bleeding. That has never once wavered." "I believe that too." Her eyes were wet now, though her voice stayed remarkably steady. "But loving me and trusting me completely in the one moment it mattered most turned out to be two different things, my lord, and I don't yet know how to build a marriage on the first without being certain of the second." He did not argue further. Some quiet, chastened part of him understood that arguing would only prove her point more thoroughly, would only confirm that he still believed his own certainty should simply overrule whatever doubt she was entitled to feel. Instead, he stood in the narrow doorway and said the only thing he had left that felt honest. "Then I'll wait," he said. "However long it takes, I won't write demanding answers. I won't arrive unannounced again, pulling you out of whatever quiet life you've built here. I'll write when you're willing to read it, and I'll come when you're willing to see me. And if that takes a year, it takes a year. And if it takes longer than that, I suppose I'll simply have to become a very patient man, because the alternative is a life without you in it. And I've discovered over these past months that I have absolutely no talent for that particular kind of living." Alina looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes that was not quite forgiveness yet, but was not quite refusal either. "Not yet," she said finally quietly. "I'm not saying no forever, my lord. I'm only saying not yet." She closed the door gently, without slamming it, and Nathaniel stood alone in the narrow hallway of a mill-town boarding house, 3 counties from home, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that her answer had not broken him the way he had feared it might. It had instead given him something to hold onto that felt sturdier than false hope ever could have. A door that had closed softly rather than violently, and the understanding that softness, in this particular circumstance, was very nearly the same thing as a promise. He rode home the following morning, and began, that same week, the long, unglamorous work of proving himself worthy of a door opening again. The first letter arrived at the boarding house in Ellsworth 2 weeks after Nathaniel's visit, and Alina nearly did not open it. She turned it over twice in her hands, recognizing the careful, slanting handwriting on the envelope, and told herself firmly that she would set it aside unread, that reading it would only invite exactly the kind of hope she had spent 2 weeks carefully teaching herself not to feel. She opened it anyway, that same evening, by the light of a single candle in her small rented room. It contained no declarations of love, no requests for her to reconsider, no pressure of any kind. It described instead, in plain and almost businesslike detail, the formal steps he had taken that week to establish, beyond any future doubt, the falseness of the accusation against her. Sworn statements from the solicitor in Bristol, a written confession from the actress Cora Blythe, who had been considerably more forthcoming once she understood the money for her silence had run out, and the money for honesty had arrived to replace it. He wrote a single line about missing her, buried near the end almost as an afterthought, and closed the letter simply, without demanding a reply. She did not answer that first letter. She read it perhaps a dozen times over the following week, and then folded it carefully into the same book of poems where the flattened white flower still rested, pressed flat and pale between two pages she had read so many times the spine had begun to crack precisely at that spot. More letters followed, one every fortnight, arriving with a steadiness that felt less like pressure and more like weather, something reliable that simply continued whether or not she responded to it. He wrote about small things mostly: a new foal born in the eastern stable, a stubborn dispute among two of the tenant farmers that he had spent an entire frustrating afternoon mediating, a book he had read and thought she might enjoy, with a brief, careful summary of its contents in case she wanted the pleasure of the story without the trouble of tracking down a copy in a mill town with no proper bookshop. He never mentioned the ball again after that first letter. He never asked when she might forgive him, never suggested a date by which her silence would become unreasonable. He simply wrote and waited, and let the accumulated weight of continued ordinary kindness do whatever slow work it was capable of doing. Alina wrote back for the first time in early winter, a short, careful letter describing nothing more significant than the mill town's first snowfall, and a kindness shown to her by an older woman named Agnes who ran the boarding house and had taken a quiet, motherly interest in the pale young woman who kept mostly to herself and worked longer hours than any of the other lodgers. She did not mention Nathaniel's letters directly, did not thank him for writing, did not offer any indication of where she stood on the larger question hanging unspoken between them. But she signed it with her full name, Alina Whitmore, rather than the false surname she had been using in Ellsworth, and Nathaniel understood, reading that single detail, that something important had shifted, even if she was not yet ready to say so plainly. Their correspondence continued through the winter months, growing slowly less careful, slowly warmer, though still without any explicit discussion of what either letter was actually building toward. Alina told him, eventually, about the mill work itself, the long hours at the loom, the ache in her hands each evening that reminded her, oddly, of the ache she had felt kneeling on the marble floor that very first day, gathering broken china with fingers that would not stop trembling. Nathaniel wrote back that he hoped, someday, her hands might know a gentler kind of ache, though he was careful even then not to press the thought any further than that single gentle suggestion. He did not visit again that winter, keeping the promise he had made in her doorway, but he sent, in place of visits, small careful gifts that never felt like bribes, a warm shawl when she mentioned the boarding house's poor heating, a proper edition of the poem she had once loved to replace her own copy's worn and water-stained pages, though he was careful to note in the accompanying letter that she should keep her own copy regardless, flower and all. Because some things mattered more pressed exactly, as they were then replaced with something newer and less lived in. It was Agnes, in the end, who finally said aloud what Alina had been avoiding admitting even to herself. "That man writes to you like a person building something," the older woman observed one evening, watching Alina read the latest letter by the kitchen fire, her expression carefully neutral in the particular way of someone who has decided to say something important and is bracing for whatever reaction follows. Not like a man trying to win an argument, like a man laying bricks, slow, one at a time, content to wait until the wall's tall enough to matter. "He hurt me, Agnes. I don't doubt it. Most men worth having eventually do, one way or another, same as most women worth having eventually hurt the men who love them. The question was never whether he'd hurt you once, child. Foolish to expect otherwise from anyone breathing. The question is what he does after, and from where I'm sitting, watching you read that letter 3 times before you've even finished your tea, I'd say he's answering that question rather well." Alina did not respond immediately, but she thought about Agnes's words for a long time afterward, turning them over the way she once turned over her mother's warning about dangerous animals, and found, slowly, that they settled into her differently than her mother's warning ever had. Her mother had warned her against wanting something too high to safely reach. Agnes was suggesting something else entirely, that the height had never been the real danger, only the character of the man standing at the top of it, and that character, unlike rank or title, was a thing a person could actually prove over time, brick by patient brick, if given enough of it to work with. She wrote back that same week, and for the first time allowed herself a single honest sentence about her own feelings, buried carefully among lines about the weather and the mill, and Agnes's persistent efforts to fatten her up with second helpings at every meal. That she thought of him more often than she had any business thinking of a man 3 counties away who had once let a room full of strangers make her doubt him, and that she did not yet know what to do with that thinking, only that it had not, despite her best efforts, faded the way she had once hoped it might. Nathaniel did not visit in response to that letter either, though every instinct in him screamed to saddle a horse immediately and ride through the night to Ellsworth. He understood, with a discipline that had cost him considerable effort to develop, that arriving now, uninvited, would undo months of careful patient building in a single reckless afternoon. Instead, he wrote back a longer letter than usual, describing in detail the small, quiet changes at Ashworth since her departure, the dower house arrangement with his mother that had settled, over the winter, into something civil if not entirely warm, the tenant families who still asked after the housekeeper's daughter who had once helped organize the harvest festival with more competence than half the estate's paid stewards combined. He closed the letter with a single direct question, the first he had allowed himself to ask outright since that evening in her doorway, whether she might consider, when the weather turned warmer, a visit home, not as anything more than a visit, simply to see her mother, to see the county in spring, with absolutely no expectation attached beyond her own safe and comfortable return. She arrived at Ashworth in early April, on a coach she paid for herself, wearing her own plain traveling dress rather than anything borrowed, and Nathaniel, warned in advance by a brief note that had arrived only a day before her, met her at the coaching inn in the village rather than presuming to greet her at the manor itself, understanding that the choice of how and where their reunion happened belonged entirely to her. She stepped down from the coach and found him waiting exactly where he had said he would be, standing alone without footmen or fanfare. And for a long moment neither of them moved, the entire village square holding its breath around them, the way rooms sometimes do when something important is happening in the middle of ordinary daily business. "You came," he said finally. "I said I would think about it. I did think about it. For 4 months, my lord, I thought of very little else." "And what did you decide?" She studied him for a long moment, this man who had written her a letter every fortnight for 4 months without once demanding an answer, who had dismantled his own mother's authority over an estate rather than let a single lie about her stand unchallenged, who had waited outside a closed door in a mill town without arguing, without pressing, without doing a single thing to make his own patience into another kind of pressure. "I decided," she said slowly, "that a man who hesitates once in a crowded ballroom and then spends 4 months proving, brick by brick, that the hesitation was the exception and not the rule, might actually be worth trusting with the rest of it." He crossed the small distance between them and took her hands, right there in the middle of the village square, in front of the coaching inn's window where 2 curious faces had already pressed themselves against the glass to watch. And this time, when he leaned down toward her, he did not stop himself at the last possible moment. He kissed her slowly, thoroughly, without any of the caution that had governed every moment they had shared before, and the small crowd gathering at the edges of the square began, almost immediately, spreading the news through the village faster than any formal announcement ever could have managed on its own. The wedding took place in early June, deliberately small, held in the old stone chapel on the Ashworth estate, rather than the grand cathedral in the county town that a ceremony of this significance would normally have commanded. Nathaniel wanted no repeat of a room too large to control, No crowd whose collective doubt might once again pull his attention away from the one person who deserved it entirely. Only close family attended. Mrs. Pretty, seated in the front pew in a new dress Nathaniel had insisted on providing. The Dowager Duchess present as well, invited despite everything, seated quietly toward the back. Her expression unreadable, but her presence, Alina understood, its own small offering toward whatever reconciliation might eventually be possible between them. Nathaniel's vows, when he spoke them, included a line he had written himself rather than borrowed from any traditional text, a line that made Alina's composure finally break, tears slipping free despite her best efforts to hold them back through the whole quiet ceremony. "I chose you once," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly working beneath it. In silence, in a garden, without the courage yet to say it plainly in front of anyone who might have argued against it. "I am choosing you again today, out loud, in front of everyone who will ever have an opinion about whether you deserve this life, so that no one, ever again, can suggest there was a single moment's doubt in my heart about which choice was the right one." Alina Ashworth walked back down the aisle of that small stone chapel as the new Duchess, and later that same afternoon, during the quiet garden reception that followed, she found herself standing near the very hearth in the main hall where she had once knelt on cold marble gathering broken china with trembling hands, her thumb wrapped in a stranger's handkerchief. She stood there now in a gown that belonged to her outright, surrounded by staff who had once looked past her and now stepped aside with quiet, respectful nods as she passed. And she understood, with a clarity that felt earned rather than given, that the title on its own had changed nothing essential about her. It was everything that had come before the title, every broken piece of china, and every soaked walk home, and every quiet fortnightly letter that had arrived without demanding anything in return, that had actually built the woman now standing in this hall as its rightful mistress. Nathaniel found her there a few minutes later, and did not say anything grand or formal. Only slipped his hand into hers the way he had done so many times before in gardens and libraries and rain-soaked carriages, and together they watched the last of the June light fall gold and warm across the same marble floor where their entire story had first begun, one broken cup at a time.